to introduce this very, very vast topic, Indian artistic and literary culture in the light of Sri Aurobindo. I'm just going to share a few small drops from the oceanic writings on every topic that Sri Aurobindo has touched. He has written extensively, and certainly on Indian art and literature also. There are plenty and plenty of essays and passing comments and incomplete commentaries and references and reviews of paintings and whatnot. There is a lot. So I thought, let me begin with a small exchange. I hope everybody can see this painting. This is a painting done by an ashram artist, Preeti Ghosh, Preeti D as we all know her as. And she was also trained by the mother, who, by the way, was an accomplished painter, artist, pianist, many other things. So this painting can be seen and understood in many ways. One can have one's own interpretation. There is a poem of Sri Aurobindo that he wrote in jail, Invitation. Somehow this poem reminds me of that. This painting reminds me of that poem also. This painting reminds me of his experience at the Shankaracharya Hill in Kashmir. So many other ways we can look at this painting and think about it. But when I was putting this together, I thought of a particular exchange that Sri Aurobindo had with Nirod Baran, with Nirodha. And most everybody here probably already knows about Sri Aurobindo's fantastic wry sense of humor. So once Nirodha asked him, from where do you get this sense of humor? And Sri Aurobindo, in his characteristic gentle smile, he said, Rasova Saha. Verily, he is the delight. He is the supreme, is the rasa, is the delight. In our morning sessions, especially Professor Paranjpe's sessions, as he emphasized this, and Anandya also spoke about, the intellectual, the thought phobia that we have been suffering with as a civilization, as a culture. In this session, I'm going to focus a little bit on the Ananda side, because this idea that everything in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy in particular, everything originates from Ananda, and everything seeks Ananda and merges in Ananda. And the idea of beauty and art is closely, in the Indian tradition, in the Indian cultural tradition, closely tied with the idea of delight, with the idea of Ananda. So Sri Aurobindo with his sense of humor was reminding Nirodha that everything is delight. Verily, the source of everything, including the sense of humor, is delight. So this painting, in some ways, which Preeti titled The Realm of Gold, is also a source of delight. And it's also a very unique thing about Indian cultures and many other ancient cultures. But Sri Aurobindo kind of like zooms into this experience-oriented nature of Indian culture. Whether it is Indian religion, Indian art, or Indian culture in general, it makes sense only when it becomes a part of one's experience. It cannot be only theorized and spoken of. One has to experience this. And again, in keeping with this Ananda theme, if the highest Indian conception of divine is about Satchitananda, the Anand aspect, again what Makaranji was reminding us from his reference to Alok Bhai's talk, and I was present when he was talking about how in Sri Aurobindo's, the mantra of the mother that Sri Aurobindo gave on Anandamayi Chaitanyamayi Satyamayi Parame. Ananda becomes the leading. Instead of Satchit Ananda coming at the end, here Ananda is the leading. So Ananda aspect of the Satchitanand is nothing but beauty taking form. That's how Sri Aurobindo speaks of the element of Ananda in Satchitanand. And that is why he has given so much emphasis in his writings on future poetry, in his writings on aesthetics in general. We find so much emphasis on the aesthetic development of the being. Because this is beauty. Appreciation of beauty, he says, is a way to experience ananda. And then he qualifies it that it need not be only in physical form. Beauty need not express itself only in the physical form. It can be a beautiful thought, a beautiful feeling, a beautiful vibration, a beautiful space that we create. And again, reminding us of the core of Indian cultural tradition, that the entire manifestation, entire creation, entire existence is nothing but a dance of Shiva and Shakti. And we have stories in our scriptures about Shiva and Shakti, the Tandava and the Lasya coming together and creating creating this manifestation or expressing this manifestation. So I've kind of like chosen variety of art forms to kind of just give you that overall experience of the richness of the Indian artistic tradition that we all are part of. This particular painting is by a Chennai-based contemporary artist, painter named Keshav Venkataraghavan. And if you have not looked up his work, I urge you to look it up on Google. He paints a new Krishna every day. So if you just type in Google Krishna for today, you'll find his amazing body of work. And they are titled under different series, Dialogue with Arjuna, New Forever. There are different series of that. This is his representation of Sri Krishna giving Arjun that Divya Chakshu, so that Arjun can see that Divya Roop, that Vishwa Roop that Sri Krishna was about to see. Again, bringing back to how important this element of beauty and art appreciation, artistic appreciation is in the overall vision of Sri Aurobindo for the future of India, future of Indian culture and civilization, as well as the future evolutionary march of humanity. I have just culled together a few lines from a couple of his poems. One which gives you the highest understanding of beauty. So what is beauty? Beauty can be anything. Beauty can be a material object that can be beautiful, or as I said, beautiful thought, beautiful shape. But Sri Aurobindo says, if Sachidanand, if it's the Ananda aspect of Sachidanand that expresses itself in the beauty, in Savitri he says this in a different sort of way, where he reminds us that beauty is his footprint showing us where he has passed. Anywhere you come across something that feels beautiful, think of it as the divine footprint that he has passed. It's this significance that he gives to developing a sense of beauty, developing a sense of appreciation of beauty. In another poem, The Divine Hearing, one of my favorite lines from his poetic writings comes, "A secret harmony steals through the blind heart, and all grows beautiful because thou art." Because divine is, everything is beautiful. Even that which in a mundane sort of understanding seems crude or ugly, there is a hidden element of beauty in it because there is divine in it. We may not have the vision to see it. That is the limitation of our vision, and that is why we constantly need those Divya Chakshus, even in smaller doses, to be able to see that beauty hidden behind everything. And all grows beautiful because thou art. So when Chaladi and I were talking about that, bring in some of the literary culture as well, but within 1 hour, how much really we can cover. So I thought, I can speak a little bit about Ramayana and Mahabharata and how Sri Aurobindo has spoken of that. But then I thought, why not his own poetry? That is also part of our literary culture. And wherever there are references made to that, I bring in here. So again, the point I want to emphasize is this idea of oneness, of beauty, delight, and harmony is very essential to the Indian understanding of art and aesthetics. And this is why Sri Aurobindo and the mother both emphasize so much on beauty and harmony, because there is a direct link of that to one's own inner journey. If one wants to grow in a harmonious way, if all parts of the being, this seminar is not meant to go into the parts of the being, which is an important aspect of Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy, Sri Aurobindo's integral vision of human nature and human growth, human developments. If all parts of the being have to be grown harmoniously, beauty and aesthetic development play a very important role in Sri Aurobindo's entire yogic philosophy. And this again is emphasized, I'm trying to bridge the gap here, if you will, though there is no gap, it's all one continuous Indian aesthetic tradition that we are talking about. Just 2 days back, I was at another conference and one art historian reminded me that, if you look at the Indian writings on aesthetics, starting from Natya Shastra, so we are talking about 1st or 2nd century, and then up to Abhinav Gupta and so many others, up to 10th century, there is a whole lot of work or conversation going on in the Indian aesthetic tradition, and after that some gap somehow comes in. And if you look at it, what else was happening from 10th century onwards, you can understand the reasons why some of those concerns that Indian mind had about beauty and aesthetics took a little bit backstage during those several centuries. And then in his presentation, this gentleman was reminding that then comes Rabindranath Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, and I kind of added, before that, even Ananda Kumar Swami, who bring back with another zeal this whole emphasis on the aesthetic nature of Indian culture in their own ways. So it's very interesting that this continuous tradition, which seems to have been broken, Sri Aurobindo brings our attention back to it, that to get a complete picture of Indian culture, we cannot forget what Ayush ji so beautifully said, the Bharati aspect of the Bhavani Bharati. And there I would just like to emphasize something that we often forget. Sri Aurobindo's out of many immense contributions to the rejuvenation of Indian cultural spirit, his works in the area of translations. So whether it was translation from Ramayana and Mahabharata, or Kalidas, his translations of Bhartrihari, his translations from Tamil, his translations from Bengali, all of that also gave a new life to the Indian literary tradition in their own way. And here I'm just pointing out our attention to one particular translation that he made of Bhartrihari's Niti Shatakam, the Century of Life, as he called them. And the one particular that I'm picking out is, which reminds us how much significance our ancestors gave to the idea of aesthetic development and artistic appreciation. The particular Shatakam that I'm reading, that I'm pointing out here is Sahitya Sangeet Kala Udina Sakshat Pashu Kuch Vishanhina. Sri Aurobindo translated that beautifully, and I'm just going to read his translation here. He said, "Some minds there are to art and beauty dead, music and poetry on whose dull ear fall barren. Horns grace not their brutish head, tails too they lack, yet is their beasthood clear. This is what Indian tradition was, that if you do not have an appreciation for art, literature, poetry, music and dance are kind of like, as if your ears are barren, you are as good as beasthood. Tails you may don't have, horns you may not have, and that's what Sri Aurobindo says this in his humor. And of course there is Bhartrihari's humor as well, topped off by Sri Aurobindo's humor, that heaven ordained not upon grass their feasts. Good fortune is this for other beasts. Thank the heavens, thank the lords that these beast-like men and women don't eat grass, otherwise no grass would have been left for actual beasts. So this is how much emphasis was given to aesthetic development, to the development of an artistic appreciation. And Sri Aurobindo says this in his very significant essays on the national value of art. I mean, the title itself is very telling. He says, art is not only for individual enjoyment or individual ananda, but there is a national value of art. There is a reason. He was very clear about the work that he was doing in the whole area of Indian culture, that a new nation is to be born. And art has to play an important role in that new national consciousness that is to be born. So in that essay, he speaks of that the point is not that everyone should become an artist, a painter, a musician or a dancer. The point is that everyone should have sufficient appreciation of all that is beautiful, all that is harmonious. And then at one place, there are four parts to this essay, and in one place he also speaks of that because we cannot bring art galleries to every home, the least one can do is create beautiful, harmonious, living surroundings so that constantly a nation, he says, a nation which is habituated to seeing that what is beautiful, what is harmonious every day, will not be attracted to what is crude and vulgar and ugly in character. So he was very conscious of the role of art as a character builder for people. So these are certain things that we must remember this. I mean, I don't know from where I found this particular painting, but it just speaks a lot to me in terms of that the continuity, that art is not something that has to be done only for museums, for art galleries, but art with a direct connection to life. This was part of the Indian tradition. Indian integral vision of art always looked at art as deeply connected with life, which by the way Mother also emphasizes at many places, that it's only a recent phenomenon that art has been cut off from life. Just like religion and spirituality are not supposed to be cut off life, the integral vision of life was always emphasized in the Indian tradition. And our texts, whether it is Natya Shastra or several other texts on Indian aesthetics, speak of that. In fact, in Vishnu Dharmottara, there is a story that goes something like when a king who is interested in learning how to make sculptures, how to make sculpture of his Isht Deva, is his chosen deity, he goes to a rishi who was an art educator also, teach me how to draw sculptures. And the rishi tells him that first, if you want to know how to make sculptures, you must know the art of painting. And the king says, sure, teach me the art of painting so that I can then make sculptures. And the rishi says, if you must learn how to paint, you should have a sense of colors, or you should have a sense of music or dance. I mean, the story goes to point out the fact that to learn one art form, you must know another one. If you want to learn how to draw, you must know how to paint. You must know how to sing. Or if you must know how to sing, you must know how to have an appreciation for poetry or literature. So art forms, the integral nature, the interconnection between arts was very much emphasized in our tradition. Just few more pictures to show you the ancient continuing tradition of art, whether it was from the rock art of Bhimbetka and many other places, or the Pashupati seal, where you see the, sort of like a precursor to certain yogic poses. The expression of inner experiences through art has been there from long time. And one of the works which had influenced Sri Aurobindo's writings on Indian art, E.B. Hevel's work on the ideals of Indian art, he has also spoken of the sacred roots of Indian art from the Vedic age. So it does not matter that at the time of the Vedas there were not outer temples. So the temple architecture might have come late in the evolution of Indian aesthetic tradition, but the very fact that rishis were expressing very sublime experiences through poetry and were erecting very elaborate yajna vedis with all kinds of emphasis and attention paid to not just the engineering but the aesthetics of the space. It shows that aesthetic sense, that artistic thing was very much alive right from that time onwards. And this is what E.B. Hevel's quote is, which Sri Aurobindo refers to in different contexts, in different ways. And I'm quoting exactly from E.B. Hevel's 1912 work, where he says, the rishis who expressed their spiritual realizations and experiences through the Vedic hymns and spoke of the spirit behind nature in beautiful imagery were great artists who gave to India monuments more durable than bronze. So this is the cultural tradition of art and aesthetics that we come from. I'm not going to go into some of these things too much, but I just want to emphasize a couple of different things about painting. So Sri Aurobindo's essays on Indian art in his volume The Renaissance in India and Other Essays on Indian Culture, there are 4 essays. One is a general one focuses specifically on temple architecture, one focuses specifically on sculpture, and one on painting. And at one point somebody had asked him, this is there in the evening talks, that Guru, I think it was probably Nirota, he used to call him as Guru. You did not say anything about Indian music and dance. And Sri Aurobindo, again with his sense of humor, said, what, tomorrow you would ask me why did I not say anything about trigonometry or something like that? And he said that my best essays in that series on Indian art were on temple architecture and sculpture, because he said architecture came more naturally to me. And by the time I came to write the essay on Indian painting, I was tired. And if you read Tales of Prison Life, there he makes a reference that he said, I had no eye for painting, the colors, but one day in the prison, some vision opened in him and he could see the deeper meaning of the colors. But if you read this essay on Indian painting, you will not feel that it's a tired mind who is writing it. And I am particularly drawn, I'm very fond of Indian sculptural tradition, of course temple architecture as well, but somehow painting, I connect more with it. So most of the examples that you will see of the images that I've selected, giving you a variety of Indian paintings. So the first one, Padmapani, is from Ajanta, and Sri Aurobindo devoted a lot of time describing the turning point in Indian painting that was made because of the Ajanta painting styles. The other one is a particular mural style from Kerala, and the bottom one is the Pahari Kangra style. This is one of my favorite depictions of Navadurga. There is something so feminine about the Durga in this depiction. The gentleness is there, and yet the feeling of Durga is there. Now, when I look at these paintings or any other paintings, and Padmapani is of course something very dear to me, because I had personally, when I stood in front of that, I just could not move. For probably in half an hour, I was just standing there stuck in front of Beloo Mehra. How from where did the artists who painted this, and we don't know the names of artists of any of these three works. One was 2000 years ago. This particular Durga is about 18th or 19th century, and the mural, I'm not sure, I just found it on Google. It was probably maybe 10 years ago or something like that, not even that old. This idea, again, we have to look at how our aestheticians, our ancestors spoke about art, and how in their vision art was not removed from the deeper spiritual purpose of life. So we have at least a couple of stories that I have been able to find which speak of the divine origin of painting. So there is one particular story that speaks of how one rishi who was deeply engaged in his ascetic practices, and the heavenly apsaras who were trying to distract him. We have many of these stories. Indra always used to get jealous and used to send apsaras to disturb the ascetic practices of any rishi who was trying to attain the Indralok. So this sage was also being disturbed by beautiful apsaras. And in a certain moment of, I don't know, maybe a little bit of rajasic anger or whatever, he just takes up the juice of a nearby tree, bark, he extracts color from the leaves, and he draws a beautiful apsara on the ground. And she is so alive, so beautiful that the actual apsaras feel ashamed and they go away. Because the painting that he had, the drawing that he had made of apsara became so full of life that the actual apsaras were, oh, kya hatayenge Guruji ko hum. So this connection of divine origin of painting is reflected through that story. And then there is another story in Chitra Lakshana which speaks of that how in a certain kingdom, the entire kingdom, the entire praja and the raja, they are so distraught because of the pain, because the head priest in that kingdom had recently lost his son and he couldn't take care of any of his responsibilities. And the king is told that if you were to draw a picture of his son, his pain would go away and he'll be okay to take care of things. And again, the idea that once the picture of that young boy who had died was drawn, that it became so alive that the entire kingdom, including the father of the son who had been killed, they came back to life. So connection of life to painting was emphasized beautifully through these couple of stories. There are many other references like that. I mentioned about the dance, about music also. There are, it's coming from Shiva's Damaru directly itself, not just the Sanskrit language, but the entire Naad itself. So Indian art, Sri Aurobindo emphasizes at its greatest. This particular sculpture is from Tamil Nadu, the Ravateshwara temple at Darasuram. This is one of the most unique Ardhnarishwar that you will see. 8-armed Ardhnarishwar. Very rare. Most of the Ardhnarishwar depictions that you see come from that. This is also a Chola temple, but this is very unique Chola representation of Ardhnarishwar. So Sri Aurobindo reminds us that the ancient Indian art at its greatest was very conscious of its highest purpose, which was to disclose something of the self, the infinite, and the divine. This is Sri Aurobindo quintessential. He uses 3 different words. Disclose something of the self, that is the Atman or the Brahman, the infinite, the Anant, and the divine. So if you also look at it, I was thinking about it, this is the 3 poises of the divine as he speaks of the individual, the universal, and the transcendent. So self through its various expressions, that's what highest art is supposed to express. The highest art also is supposed to express the infinite through its many, many living finite symbols. And the highest art is also supposed to express the divine through its many powers, any power. Now, this at its greatest, Sri Aurobindo uses his words very carefully. He says, at its greatest. And then he qualifies, it does not mean that all ancient Indian art was great. He said there were many other so-called mediocre works or works of art, because art in India was not cut off from life in the sense that it was only meant for temples or yajna-shalas. Art was being used for many other purposes. So art had its own, other utilitarian uses as well. For example, in the Natya Shastra, you find great references to the Alankara, which amazingly to this day we see this. The Kolam tradition of Tamil Nadu or the Rangoli or throughout India, Alpana from Bengal, that was done on a day-to-day, everyday basis. So the idea of decorating one's homes, entrances, decorating one's pillars in the home, all those things were also considered part of the Indian artistic tradition. This separation that we made actually, especially after independence, as Anand Bhaiya was talking about how far removed we are from our own cultural tradition, Indian aesthetic tradition did not distinguish between high classical art and folk art. These are very artificial boundaries that have been gotten created. All art was art, connected with some or the other dimension of life. So this integral vision is very important. Or at the most, if art is not able to do any of these things, the least it can do, he's saying the least, but that's also a very high purpose. The Godheads are to be revealed, interpreted, or in some way suggested to the soul's understanding, or to its devotion, or at the very least, to a spiritually or religiously aesthetic emotion. So art is meant to arouse, at the very least, a spiritually or religiously aesthetic emotion. Which again, if you read what he says in his national values of art, that is the highest function of art. The lowest one is the aesthetic function, which itself is quite high if you think about it. Again, few more examples of various artistic traditions, both painting as well as sculpture. The first two top sculptures are from the Hoysala temples at Karnataka, Beloo and Helabid. One is from Beloo, one is from Helabid. The Chinnakeshwar temple and the other one, I'm forgetting its name. And the bottom panel is, if you haven't seen, you have to see it to believe it, that it's a panel carved in stone of Mahishasur Mardini. But if you stand at a certain angle, this is in Mahabalipuram, Mamalapuram, 1.5 hour drive from Chennai, between Pondicherry and Chennai. From a certain angle, you can actually see the dynamism in the sculpture. It's as if the Durga, the Mahishasur Mardini, is really charging on the Mahishasur. You have to stand there to believe it. And it's hiding in some cave in Mahabalipuram. These are our gems. And again, the beautiful painting there on base, inspired by Jayadev's Geet Govinda of Krishna putting some alta at the feet of Radha. So, I mean, these are just beautiful depictions that we have. The point that Sri Aurobindo emphasizes that Indian art has always been identical in its aim, in its spiritual aim and principle with the rest of the culture. Even when there was an effort to depict something from so-called mundane life, there was always an emphasis on some higher emotion. We cannot ignore that. Okay. Next one. This is again from Ajanta. And I chose this particular piece of work because Sri Aurobindo has written a very large commentary on this particular piece of painting, this particular piece of artwork. It is from, he called it as the Adoration group of paintings. I believe this is cave 16. This is when Buddha, after attaining enlightenment, after Siddhartha has become Buddha, he goes back to meet his wife, Yashodhara, and their son, Rahul, who are depicted as kind of like two tiny figures at the bottom. And Sri Aurobindo has spoken beautifully of this work of art to demonstrate how the Indian artist, the aim that Indian artist had in his or her mind was to depict, express the spiritual emotion, not necessarily the exact physical likeness of the human or the object that is being expressed. So Buddha is a very tall figure. Yashodhara and Rahul are very tiny figures, but the expression on their faces, the way they are looking up, and Sri Aurobindo describes that. I'm just speaking in a very ordinary language. You have to read it to feel the poetry of that. Because even Yashodhara and Rahul, the story goes that, when Rahul asks Yashodhara, who is he? And she tells him, he's your father. But to him, he is not just my father, he is the Father Supreme, the Divine Supreme. And that expression is caught so beautifully in the eyes of the little boy. And Sri Aurobindo describes this. It's an adoration of the divine. That's why he called it that this is from the Adoration group of paintings. And two other points that I will mention in connection to this, where Sri Aurobindo says what is unique about the Indian artistic tradition is that an Indian artist is not interested in reality for the sake of the reality. In today's day and age, where cinema has become a very important popular form of art, and at one point which Natya used to be an integrative art form, incorporating all art forms, whether it is music, dance, costume, hair, do, set design, every art form was included in Natak. Cinema is the alternative today from a technological point of view. And there is a particular emphasis, especially in modern cinema, on realism. I jokingly, I don't know how many of you people here watch Hindi movies, but I call it as the Anurag Kashyap school of Hindi cinema, which is like, realism for the sake of realism, gore realism for the sake of gore realism. Indian tradition was very clear that art is supposed to uplift and elevate from wherever we are in our mundane, emotional prison, mental prison, wherever, whatever is going on in our life. Art is supposed to bring us out of that and to inspire us to elevate. But realistic portrayal of art, especially realistic cinema, there's like people who say, ye kya? Bollywood mein aisa dikha dete hain, aisa dikha dete hain, this is all so unreal. But if I have to see reality, I might as well just walk around, right? So I go to a cinema, or I go to want to experience art so that it will take me away, to give me something of beauty to experience. So Sri Aurobindo used a very interesting expression. He said when an artist tries to express reality only for the sake of reality, he called it as tyranny of the eye. It becomes tyrannous, torturous, that what you see is what you get. That's very limited. So he said that's not the Indian way of the artist. That's not the Indian art at its highest is. As per the Indian artistic theory, that person is the true artist who has an inner vision to see things beyond the surface. So an artist also has to be a yogi in that sense. So that sukshma drishti, that deep vision, inner vision is important. The second thing he cautions about is that art is also not supposed to be only expressive of beauty for the sake of beauty. That he called it as tyranny of the aesthetic imagination. That you can only imagine up to beautiful. What if there is hidden beauty in what your aesthetic imagination looks at as ugly? So that also, beauty for the sake of beauty can also not be the aim of the Indian artist, he said. So I have already spoken of this, the idea of art as yoga for the artist. Sri Aurobindo emphasizes this in his future vision for Indian artistic aesthetic culture, for the future of Indian nation and culture, that the true Indian artist has to develop the Indian way of looking at things with an inner vision. This is true of the literary culture also today. Nowadays it has become very popular to have all kinds of retellings of Ramayana and Mahabharata and various Puranic stories. How do we know to what extent they are authentic understandings, or to what extent one should look at how they capture the spirit of the Indian cultural, the Indian literary story that was being expressed through Ramayana or Mahabharata or this Puran or that Puran? The test can be very simple. Did this writer have that inner vision? Was he or she able to envision the story of Draupadi Chir Haran, for example, or the Sita Lakshman Rekha episode? Was there a new vision that the writer had? If yes, then maybe his or her retelling will stand the test of time. If there is no vision and the only criteria is, can I interpret this using this postmodernist feminist framework, that will not stand the test of time. It will be a good, interesting one-time read, and then you will say, let me go back to Tulsidasa's Ramayana. Because that you can read again and again and again, and every time there is a new insight that comes from it. And then when you read Valmiki, you will actually find that, by the way, there was no Lakshman Rekha. But so what happened between the time of Valmiki and the time of Tulsi that this Lakshman Rekha came into being? And then you start digging into the history of Indian civilizational history and the Indian sociological history and what was going on. And those are the ways we get deeper into appreciating our literary culture. Not just because this and this feminist framework is in fashion. One other thing that Sri Aurobindo cautions when he speaks of the idea of art as yoga, that every artist, every writer, every poet, anybody who is with this, working in this field of creative domain, intellectual domain also, there is a tendency to seek social applause, acceptance, fame, popularity. That part has to be checked and reined in if art has to be taken up in the spirit of yoga. So this is another very interesting caution that Sri Aurobindo reminds us of. Few more paintings here. As I said, I'm more drawn to painting. These are more contemporary works of art. Amrita Shergill, who actually, Sri Aurobindo had made one or two references to her work as well. And Amrita Shergill is an interesting artist also because she was trained in the Western realistic painting, schools of painting. And she comes to India and she spends time at Ajanta, and she is known to have made a reference that one look at the paintings of Ajanta and all my training of the German, French painting traditions kind of goes off, because nothing ever comes close to what she could gather just by looking at the works of Ajanta. And some of her works later on, the one particular here that is mentioned here, it's called the Bride of the Toilet of the Bride. So a bride is being made ready by her friends. So this was very much inspired by the forms that she had seen in Ajanta, the fluidity of the forms. Jaimini Roy also, who was very much deeply influenced by the Bengal folk art traditions, but some of his early works also were very deeply inspired by Ajanta, this particular painting of mother and child. And S.H. Raza, I've used his example here, used this particular work here. He is from one of those what you call as the progressive school of artists, in which M.F. Hussain, Souza and several other artists were there. He was also trained in France, in Paris, in all the Impressionist, post-Impressionistic school of painting. But since childhood, somehow something in him, growing up in India, he was drawn to some specific aspects of Indian philosophy, particularly the concept of Bindu, the dot from which everything originates. That one dot. And all his later works, after he came back to settle in India, after having attained his fame in Europe, his art changes and his works, I mean, he was one of the highest selling painters of India ever, all times. I think he just passed away maybe 4 or 5 years back. So if you Google S.H. Raza's work, he's like sold at a very, very high price at Christie's and Sotheby's. But all his work, at the end of the day, are influenced by this Indian philosophic idea of that origin, that one dot from which all originates. Syed Haider Raza. I don't think I need to go, I've already spoken of some of these things. I'll just give you a few more examples and maybe I will end with this one story. So if the method of the Indian artist has always been first see the vision within, how can the method of appreciating of Indian art be any different? So in one cryptic sentence, Sri Aurobindo explains this beautifully. Soul realization is its method of creation. Its meaning, the method of creation of Indian art. Soul realization is its method of creation, and soul realization must be the way of our response and understanding. If we want to appreciate Indian artistic literary culture, we have to develop that same inner drishti which the artists were supposed to have while creating that work of art. And the two works of art that I have depicted there, one is again from Ajanta, the Buddha Mahaparinirvan, and the other is a more contemporary painting titled Sati by Nandlal Bose. Nandlal Bose, who was a student of Abanindranath Tagore in that Bengal school of art, which Sri Aurobindo has spent a lot of time writing about, that school of art which sort of like became the renewal, the revival of the Indian painting. Under Indian painting, which had, after the time of Ajanta, it had peaked at the time of Ajanta, continued till maybe Rajput time, and then under very strong influences from the British European schools of painting, it had become very imitative. Anand Bhaiya was speaking of earlier about that we were, very good at copy-paste, imitating kind of culture. In painting also it had happened like that. So this company school of painting, or someone that most everybody in India has seen, some or the other work, the calendar art of Lakshmi and Saraswati, which is all inspired by one artist, Raja Ravi Verma, an imitative artist. Sri Aurobindo doesn't have kind words to speak of his school of painting, but because of his access to the money from the royal family of Travancore and the printing press, the lithograph, the calendar art became so popular, and every Hindu household has some or the other calendar of that Lakshmi or Saraswati of Raja Ravi Verma, or Shakuntala that he had painted and things like that. Anyway, Bengal school of paintings led by Abanindranath Tagore at Shantiniketan They sort of became the leading voice of bringing back in a new way, giving a new life to the Ajanta style of painting and yet bringing the more modernity to it. So Nandalal Bose, who also became very famous because he was the illustrator of every page of the original Indian Constitution. If you look at the original Indian Constitution manuscript, every page has an illustration by Nandalal Bose. So this painting he had made, which was titled Sati, based on the story of Sati, who had self-immolated herself after she finds out that her father had not invited her husband Shiva to the Mahayagna that he was doing, in which all the other gods were invited. So there is a particular biography of Nandalal Bose in which this story is mentioned, that when Anand Kumar Swami, who is popular for his book, The Dance of Shiva, and I think there is a subtitle to that book also. When Anand Kumar Swami sees this work of art, he asks Nandalal Bose, "Do you know the story of Sati?" And I have the story, I have that particular reference from the biography here, sorry. So Nandalal Bose tells him, "Yes, I know the story that she had killed herself, throwing herself into the yagna fire of her father Daksh Prajapati because she was angry at him." And he said, "That's all I know. I don't know if there is any deeper meaning to this story." And Anand Kumar Swami explains to him the deeper meaning of the story, and I will conclude with that because otherwise I could go on and on. There is so much about Indian art. So this is what he says. Anand Kumar Swami tells, on hearing what Nandalal Bose had said, Kumar Swami spoke about Indian womanhood. He said, "No figure in the world's art could be more selfless, more wrapped in the unity of personal devotion, more terribly sweet and perfect than this young, serene Bengali girl." This is portrayal of a young, serene Bengali girl as Sati. "Whom scorching flames wake not from her dream of him, the Supreme, the Divine, who is her Lord in death and life." So even the scorching flames could not wake her from this dream that she is having of her Lord in death and life. This is the perfect picture of womanhood, of personal devotion. Anand Kumar Swami is explaining the artist. And then he says, "Not idly it is said that to Indian women, the husband lover is her God. But this has a spiritual, not domestic sense." This is the crux of the matter. Not for any other reason it is said that for Indian women, the husband lover is her God, but this has a spiritual significance, not in the domestic sense, in which it is often misinterpreted. To all great lovers comes the knowledge that the one is Shakti and the other Mahadev. Love then is more than personal. So yes, Pati is Parmeshwar, but Patni is also Parmeshwari. This is what the Indian tradition speaks of. To all great lovers comes the knowledge that one is Shakti, the other is Mahadev. This, according to this aesthetician, Indian aesthetician of the modern times, Anand Kumar Swami, is what the story of Sati represents as depicted in this painting. This idea that one is Shakti, one is Ishvara, one is Parmeshwar, one is Parmeshwari, only when the two come together, the perfect love is born, perfect existence is born. This is how we can and we must understand Indian artistic and literary culture when looked at it from the integral vision of Indian culture that Sri Aurobindo has given us. So with that, I'm going to stop here. As I said, there are many more examples that I can give of Indian art, whether it is from sculpture, architecture, painting, but post-lunch, I think this much exposure is enough. So thank you for your